has had a whole range of different strategies, right? I mean, you've got cooperativism, and there's still people around like Solidarity Economy Network. People advocate that. You've got electoral socialism or socialism via the ballot box, and the majority Democratic Socialists in America push that strategy. You've got a few remnants of Marxist-Leninist groups with their vanguard party strategy to gain control of the state. And then you have revolutionary libertarian unionism or syndicalism, which historically is the most important anarchist-supported strategy. I wanted to start by talking about the question of how do you decide which strategy is best? How do you decide what is a plausible strategy for working to change society? And there's a concept I think is very fundamental, very important here. It's the process that's called class formation. So that if you look at certain periods of time when there's relatively low levels of struggle and low levels of radical consciousness, then there's other periods of time that you can look at, like say in the 1930s, the First World War era, when there was just massive levels of working class resistance in the system. Thousands of strikes every year, workplace occupations, and so on, and growing socialist consciousness. So what we can see from that is that at certain periods, the working class is building the actual capacity, the actual ability to fundamentally challenge the owning and managing classes for the control of society. And then there are other periods of times where that ability has not yet been built up. So the process of class formation is exactly the process of building up that capacity. It's a more or less protracted process where the working class develops its organizations, builds its organizational strength, its class consciousness, builds a level of struggle of resistance to the system. People develop confidence, develop radical ideas, become much more widespread. Okay, the protracted period in which that takes place, that's called class formation. The working class is forming itself, it has to form itself into a relatively unified, cohesive alliance or bloc, so that this means various internal divisions have to be overcome, like along lines of race and gender. There has to be greater cohesion through greater mutual solidarity between different kinds of social movement organizations, right? So that's part of the process of class formation, of building the level of resistance and power that the working class actually has to the system. Okay, so the problem is here that since the Second World War, there's been some very fundamental barriers to this process being able to be advanced further. And two of these problems are, first of all, what I call the legal cage. Since the Second World War, all sorts of laws and court decisions have been passed that basically outlaw all of the most effective forms of working class action, which were used in previous eras, like workplace occupations, very intense mass picketing, strikes during when contracts are still in force. So there was regular striking in opposition to management power of the workplace. These things have all been rendered illegal. And the problem here then is the other part of the problem we face is what I call the problem of the bureaucratic layer. Because since the Second World War, in all the developed capitalist countries, the unions have become increasingly intensely controlled by the pay bureaucratic layers, state officials, staff. So the decision-making of the union becomes concentrated in their hands. And the problem is, and this is especially intensified because of the change in the laws, they will tend to resist the development of the conflict, the level of conflict against the employers to protect the legal and financial viability of the union, especially when you consider that so many kinds of actions have been rendered illegal, right? And so it's true that they will develop some struggles, some strikes. They have to do that because they wouldn't have any leverage. How are they going to negotiate the employers? if they don't have strikes at all, but they will want to keep a certain limit on just how far it goes, how much, how much joint actions between different unions, for example, like the days of the general strikes past, or sympathy actions and so forth. And so they will try to limit that, the level of action. So, and that becomes a problem because it's a problem because essentially the labor movement, which is now today, only 6% of workers in the private sector belong to unions. This is less than in 1900. It's like back to square one. Okay. And the only way that's going to be changed is by the ability to redevelop, the ability to have very effective strike actions. And this is going to mean inevitably violating the law. You have to basically, the working class has to develop an organization and kinds of actions and so forth that can allow them to roll over the laws, okay, and to get away with it. And there's actually been some, if you go back to the 60s when there was a somewhat smaller labor insurgency than there was in the 30s earlier, teacher unionism was built in that period through huge numbers of illegal teacher strikes. They forced state legislatures to legalize teacher strikes. So this is an example of what I mean by you have to have the capacity to do illegal actions. And the problem also exists at the level of the electoral level, because there's a kind of bureaucratic layer there too. If you think of all the labor and socialist and Euro-communist parties in Europe, the bureaucratic layer there is the professional politicians, the party organizations, and they will only want to see a level of disruption to a certain level, because if the how political ideas being presented are quite radical, there's very major fundamental changes being followed, there's very high levels of disruption, they're going to be afraid of losing votes. They're going to be afraid of being kicked out of office. So this has led to a process of degeneration throughout the period since World War II, of all the labor, socialist, and Euro-communist parties. So this is the fundamental problem of the bureaucratic layer. Now, what I'm going to argue here is that syndicalism poses a solution to the problem of the bureaucratic layer. And the reason is because we propose that we build movements and engage in kinds of actions that don't rely upon that layer. So it's the idea of building unions as self-managed worker organizations where the basis of the decision making lies in the general meetings and in things like elected and revocable delegates that are there in the workplace, like shop stewards councils, people, the leadership that are on the job, not a bureaucratic layer. And when you have like secretaries and so forth, you have rotation in office. And so like syndicalist unions in Spain that still survive to some extent, they practice that. They have rules that you can only be part of the union secretariat for a certain number of years, and you got to go back and leave it. So, and that's part of it is building a self-managed union. Part of it also is in terms of the relationships to other unions through horizontal federation, through links. So you have things like rank and file conferences of rank and file delegates, rather than unifying the labor movement through a executive boards and paid officials at the top, right? And also another part of it is developing links to other kinds of social movement organizations, to renter organizations, environmental organizations, all kinds of other social movement organizations. Because part of the process of class formation is building greater cohesion and mutual support among all of the oppressed and exploited majority, so that you could bring all of these huge social forces together into what Gramsci would call a counter-hegemonic bloc or alliance, social movement alliance. And it's at that point then you see that the working class would have the kind of power that potentially it would have actually the ability to kick out the owning and management classes and take over control of the economy. Right. And so that's my argument basically for syndicalism right there. And so that's kind of the argument that I wanted to present. And so at this point, then, we can have a discussion about it. people can raise questions, comments, or whatever. So anyone have anything to say? We are very much in favor of organization and preparation because the process of social class formation requires a tremendous amount of organizing, building of organizations, and also popular education efforts to prepare people to develop their ideas, develop their skills as organizers, as protagonists, activists, right? And so you have to have organizations for that. If you look at, for example, the anarcho-syndicalist movement in Spain in the 30s and 20s, they had a vast layer of organizations. They had what they storefront worker schools called Ateneos, where a lot of there were workshops on social theory, on literacy. A lot of people, especially women, were illiterate. They were teaching literacy, and those are just, and in this country too, if you go back to the World War I 30s era, there are a lot of different forms of popular education through workshops and publications, including by anarchists. And and the idea is then you build an organization, the union organizations, they have a formal structure, they have a democratic structure of decision making. So it's not anti-organization. And the goal in terms of the transition to a different kind of society, what the guarantee that we have not to end up with a totalitarian regime is in precisely the democratic self-managed character of the large mass movement that we built. Because what's going to happen in a period of great turbulence and social conflict and transformation is that it's the movement that drives that. Its character will determine the outcome. So if you have that process driven by a very highly democratic movement with a very strong democratic culture, like the example being the CNTU in Spain in the 30s, then what you end up with is democratic organizations of control. So for example, they expropriated 80% of the economy in northeastern Spain and built industrial federations rooted in the assemblies in the workplace and election of delegates. And that's how they run it. It was run on a democratic basis. And in terms of their vision for governance, it was not to have a state, but there would also be nonetheless something akin to a government, because they were proposing that the unions would build an army they called the proletarian army, and they wanted it to be the dominant power, armed power in the country. And there would be councils that would be elected by the delegates from the unions. And so there would be had control things like they had police, they had an anarchist police force in Barcelona. Control was largely drawn from people who lived there and people were not necessarily full-time police, right? And so they had a way of taking over what we would think of as state functions, like control of security and an army, without it being the kind of top-down bureaucratic managerial structure you have in the state. The problem with states is that they have class oppression built into them. You have this complete subordination of the public sector workers to these managerial hierarchies, right? So you're not getting away from the class system if you build everything around a state. And so that's another way in which syndicalism is an alternative to like state socialist kinds of strategies, like those proposed by the Marxists. Anyway, for example, there's some highly democratic revolutionary Marxist tendencies that when they tell me that they have very similar views, that's because they reject the Marxist-Leninist, right? And see the process of revolution is coming about from below through the working class bullying kind of movement. So that's what they have in common. Yeah, on the question of contractualism, that's actually a debate inside the IWW. I tend to take the view that it's okay to enter into agreements with employers as long as certain conditions are met, as long as there's no strike clause, there's no management rights clause, so you're not binding agreements. And if you look back actually at the history of the IWW in World War I era, when it was at its height, 50,000 members, they entered into agreements. The MTWIU, which was their maritime union in Philadelphia, which eventually was like up to about 5,000 members, they had agreements with the employers, but they signed a first agreement in 1912. Negotiating agreements, one thing that's important, from the simplest point of view, is to some of the workers themselves through their elected negotiating, not through paid officials. And when the IWW negotiated that contract in 1913 for the Port of Philadelphia, it was 3 rank and file longshoremen who they elected to do that. But over the next 5 years, they had to have 5 strikes just to defend their contract, because the employers would go back on the deal that they agreed to. And therefore, they needed to have the right to strike over grievances, right? Because arbitrary management powers go away. So you have to have the ability to constantly work against that, right? And I think that it's possible to make agreements without binding your hands, because your workers will gain certain things from the agreement, and then make sure everyone knows what the employers agreed to, the things that were of advantage to you and your co-workers, right? And then you have then surveillance of them, right? And you can then take action if they go back, like they're going to start using favoritism, or they're going to start reducing wages or whatever it is. Yeah. Yes.
Wayne.
Oh, Wayne's got a question. Sorry. Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, I want to make a brief, just make a couple of things. Many years ago, when I spoke to one of your comrades, Steve Rabinowitz, and I asked him, is there a book on syndicalism? And he said, well, there are books by Rudolf Rocker. And I said, yeah, but he wrote decades, generations ago. Is anything current? And he couldn't think of anything. So I want to say that this is the book. This is the book I was looking for, and I'm very glad to see it. I do have a question about it, though, that perhaps is not so important, but I identify as an anarchist, and in the past you've identified as an anarchist, but nowhere in this book do you say that you are an anarchist, that the perspective you're making is anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist. Use revolutionary syndicalist and libertarian socialist, both of which are perfectly fine labels, but you don't say that you are an anarchist or an anarcho-syndicalist, and I think that's, considering that there is a radical movement that's regarding itself as anarchist, I think that's somewhat an error, and I wonder if you would comment on that. And lastly, let me say that it's very important that you're suggesting an anti-electoral perspective as compared to somebody like Kim Moody or others who are may criticize the Democrats, but that actually working with the Democrats, working for election is the major strategy of the major unions in this country and even of the DSA. But not only, but somebody like Moody might even reject the strategy of working with the Democrats, but still is in favor of a new party, a Labor Party or something. And these people just don't get it. What the whole history of parties and socialist parties which have appeared and grown and get elected and then been defeated in one way or another. I won't go into it, but as you know, it always becomes a dead end. And it's very good to see a book like yours that makes it very clear that you're against electoral orientation.
Thank you, Wayne. Yeah, it is like that was my argument with respect to how parties inevitably tend to develop this bureaucratic layer that restricts the level of struggle, restricts the level of radical challenge to the system. I didn't use the word anarchism because, I mean, I basically think of anarchism as the libertarian form of socialism.
Right.
So I'm kind of using a euphemism, you might say. And part of the reason for that is because in this country, anarchism is not very well known, and there's a lot of like crazy ideas that some people have about what anarchism is. And so I didn't want to have to deal with that, right? And it's just basically more, it's convenient as a messaging decision on my part. Basically. Development of links to different groups of people may be helpful in the case of education. We've seen that quite a bit with things like relationships to parents, like in strikes and so forth, and also to the non-teachers in the schools, right? So building cross-group links is part of how then you can take on other issues, for example, that come up and become then more elements of action for that organization.
I'm also a UTLA member. I'm a teacher myself. So we're going back to school next week. So it's kind of a nice way to end the summer. But yeah, I also think about that question too, like how we can radically unionize. And what I've seen in my high school, because I'm a special education teacher too, that my department is actually pretty radical themselves. At our high school, so if you start like within your school itself, and I'm speaking as a teacher, but I think just overall, like in organizing, you start local, right? And I even think about like some of the principles in the IWW, being a wobbly myself, is the AEIOU, agitate, A, E is educate, O is, AEI is inculcate, organize, and then unionize. So from that, like, that's how I take that perspective. And I work with my colleagues, and obviously we're gonna have different perspectives in educating, but this also applies to just work in general. So when you apply these like principles from there, that's when you can start like saying, okay, you build that movement within, because once you take over the school or the workplace, that's where it can go and cross. Because when we take a behemoth like UTLA as an example, it can be very overwhelming. But there are people within that. It's just that different schools is like how they're going to partner, build that movement. So just want to kind of like talk about that, but also being a wobbly connection with this.
Another tactic here that's relevant to this kind of situation is developing parallel networks of activists in the different sites. So like in different schools. And this is one of the key ways of bird dogging the bureaucracy of the unions. And my group has connections to a group called Railroad Workers United that have been doing this very effectively, because the three unions, the craft unions and the railroad industry, will sell them out. I mean, they're very bureaucratic. And so, for example, with the potential railroad strike, they were against the railroad strike, even though a majority of the workers voted against the contract. And a majority of the members of Railroad Workers United supported the strike. There just was not sufficient social backing within that industry to carry it out. There was actually a wildcat railroad strike in 1970. But 1970, as I was talking to a member of RWU, he said that was a different era. Because that was the era when there were wildcat strikes all over the place. There was a wildcat strike of truck drivers here in LA. There was a wildcat strike of postal workers. And so they felt like, okay, we can do this. We can get away with this. You know, and they did. They did get away with it, violating the law back then. So yeah, but I think that these networks or organizations that are parallel to and independent of the bureaucracy, keeping the workers informed, and they can become a basis then for building movements for actions. There are actions that occasionally take place. My department actually had a one-day sit-down strike. We got our manager fired. Right, but I mean, a sustained organizing was very difficult in the year 2000. I was part of an attempt to build an independent tech worker union called Digital Workers Alliance, a lot of programmers, web designers and so forth. But then that was right when the .com crash happened and 30,000 jobs were eliminated. Management is not really a part of the working class. They're a part of the bureaucratic control class. That's what I call it. Because they're hired by the owners to control you, to control workers. that's their job. Their job is kind of like being cops, to control the working class and to run be responsible for running ventures, during the day, during the day-to-day management of everybody. So they're basically like they're carrying out the interests of numbers, right? So there's this category that Graeber calls bullshit jobs, where and I've seen this in practice when I was working in that industry. A manager wants, like, he's got to do report stuff for manager. He'll hire some gopher, like, dig up all the facts on this and on this. And it's like, this is what Graeber was talking about, jobs at this time. But it's built into, it's part of the management control system. And so I don't really see any potential for organizing of them, because they're part of basic industry employs basically 25% of the workforce. And then you have really large scale retail enterprises and big healthcare operations, hospitals. And then you have also teachers, which are very large in number, right? And so because of their numbers, because they're often organized, and because of the essential character of things like supermarket chains, that there is actual potential leverage that we might see. But I mean, then there are some people there. The problem is, like, when people work in really tiny little micro businesses or nonprofits that are very marginal, so then they have much less leverage. Yeah, so I think that's why historically there is more of a priority to try to organize the industries where the people there would have greater degree of potential leverage. Computer manufacturing company, but yeah, organizing definitely takes place, in among renters. I mean, just 2 years ago, the LA tenancy union had a huge wave of rent strikes, right, because of the rent inflation that was taking place, and a bunch of the buildings were being bought up by these finance capitalist types that would want to jack up the rents and extract more profit from the buildings. But so yeah, it certainly is possible to organize tenants and to carry out strikes. I also did tenant organizing when in San Francisco, we built a community land trust to do as an anti-displacement tactic, where what we would do is we would buy out the landlords. So to do that, we would organize the tenants, because the tenants would put pressure on the landlords. And sometimes they would just sell to us because it's much trouble. And that community land trust now has, like, I don't know, a dozen or more buildings that they've acquired. And these are all working class housing, working class apartment buildings. So yeah, direct organizing of the tenants can have leverage in various ways.
Tom, I just want to lay there's like 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Maybe Wayne wants that.
Yeah, Wayne, do you want
to
say?
Well, it depends on a whole lot of things, including the way the economy is going. Right now, the gap between most workers and the crisis, the extent of the difficulties going on, is really enormous. And the things that show the fundamental crisis of the system, such as the ecological crisis, the environmental crisis, that's sort of seen separate from the economic problems or the political problems. You're quite right, though, the difficulty of organizing people, and it's exciting that there is this wave of strikes and labor struggle that's going on right now in this country, partly because of the shortage of the low level of unemployment, which gives workers a greater leverage than they've had in quite a while. And on the other hand, it's been since the 70s or earlier that there's been any kind of increase in the average level of wages, in spite of all the talk about, look how wonderful the economy is and Biden can take credit for it or whatnot, that the liberals are all saying, that Democrats are all saying. In fact, things have been pretty tough for working people. And they've held people down either by the better off workers, giving them just a little bit more to keep them satisfied, and the worse off workers to try to just demoralize them and hold them down. And it's a terrific thing that there's been this breakthrough in a whole range of different fields, which in different circumstances. It's just thrilling in the last few years, and especially now. And I think Tom is quite right that there's this upsurge going on, and it's unfortunate that there's not enough radicals and the syndicalists and anarchists there to push this in a more revolutionary and radically democratic direction. The big unions try to keep things under their control, but things are even getting harder for the bureaucrats nowadays.
Right, and I'm glad that you brought up the environmental crisis, because there's actually a growing tendency now towards workers taking action directly for environmental demands. Just a few weeks ago in Germany, there was this massive strike of 200,000 transit workers, backed by all the various environmental organizations. They weren't just asking for wage increases. They wanted to lower the fares and make for more affordable public transit, so that to move people away from cars and onto public transit. There's the strike going on right now at the old Erie Locomotive Works in Erie, Pennsylvania, where the United Electrical Workers Union, they're striking to recover their right to strike over grievances, but they're also striking to force the employer to work with them in developing green locomotives. So these would be like diesels that would have a more efficient engines, and also electric battery powered locomotives for yard switching. And there's also another thing on the same topic, big strike going on in the French and Spanish fishing fleets, which were allowed by the EU to hire workers from West Africa. Well, what they did is they hired these people at pennies, so paying them starvation wages, way below, what they should be paid. But that's part of the reason for the strike, but that's not the only reason. The fishing workers are pointing out that these big Spanish and French fishing companies are violating the law, using these huge, massive nets and just scarfing up everything in the sea, and there's no observers on the boats like they're supposed to be. So they're doing non-sustainable fishing that totally wipe out the fishery doing that. And so that's another reason. So there you have an environmental issue, major environmental issue, with the destruction of the fisheries, because of these capitalist fishing firms and their behaviors. And there we have workers striking rest. So and there's been some other examples of this too. So I think that you're going to see an increasing connection that workers make, where their employers are engaged in environmentally destructive actions. And that becomes an issue for them that they can organize.
The UPS workers, one of their demands was air conditioning in their cabs.
That's right.
Right.
There've been a bunch of UPS drivers that have died from heat exhaustion. One guy was, close. The temperature in the back of his van was 150 degrees. And so that's a very legitimate demand now with increasing temperatures, right? And you're going to see more demands in that going on. So this leads to the connection between labor movement, working class growth itself, and the struggle over the environmental future.
So with that, Tom, Wayne, for not coming. So I want to thank you, Tom, Wayne. We do have Tom's book here. Wayne, you can look him up, Wayne Price. He's written a lot too.
I think some of his books are here too.
Yeah, I think we do have some of your books, Wayne, over here. So, but with that, we want to thank you for coming to this workshop.
Yeah.